Despite the fact that in Poland after the Second World War there were two committees whose task was to collect documents and reports relating to the period of Nazi to the period of the Holocaust, and which managed to collect thousands of testimonies. Many of these materials for many years were not used. In the years 1944-47 in Poland were active Jewish historical commissions, which have been transformed in 1947 into the Jewish Historical Institute. On the other hand, the main commission for the investigation of Nazi crimes in Poland continued its activities, but these committees have focused mainly on the concentration and extermination camps, ghettos and labor camps, as well as places of mass murder. In post-war Poland, there was so-called August Decree, the law of August 31, 1944, on the basis of which were investigated and sentenced Nazis and their collaborators. Indeed, in post-war Poland took place thousands of investigations and trials, and thousands of people were convicted for committing various crimes and collaboration with the Nazis. Material of those trials was then stored in the archives of the main Commission for the Investigation of Nazi Crime in Poland and state archives. Despite of all these documents and the memory is still fresh of what happened to the whole society, just some years ago, the communist government managed to create a distorted picture of the reality during the occupation. This seems paradoxical, but how it was possible to create myths and that were in such great contrast with reality? Did the communist regime was so powerful, or rather the newly created myths formed part of Polish tradition, and because they were so readily accepted? It seems that it was true. Post-war Europe, despite the division into two great political blocs, was still rooted in bondage of nationalism. This was not only in Poland but also in other countries. As an example, we may quote the so-called grandfather in the Wehrmacht and Polish grandfather in German families. I'm thinking about two books that appeared recently. One of Ryszard Kaczmarek about Polish citizens in the Wehrmacht. There were about 500,000. And Polish grandfather in a German family. It was a book of Kolja Mensing, Die Legende der Väter, published in 2011. So these facts were concerning millions of people were hidden and not find their way into official historiography. But the problem of national historiography is not only the problem of Poland but also of many other countries. In the case of what was Eastern Poland until 1949, or Polish borderlands in Polish Kresy Wschodnie, we have to deal with the clash of different national narratives and different overlapping historiographies. Those national agendas were for many years a principal obstacle to arrive to the truth and to write history which would not be in the service of political agendas. The problem is much more complex. After the end of the communist period, we could have expected completely new stage of historical research. However, the new period of freedom and regaining true independence by most countries of Central Eastern Europe gave also a possibility of return to conservative and nationalist positions by a part of society. At the same time, many archives in the area became accessible, and a lot of new material previously unknown or not accessible came to light. Actually, the generation who were witnesses to the events of the Second World War are going away, but not only the documents speak. First of all, people speak. In those who were witnesses or participants of the events of the Second World War, were not able to transfer the knowledge and truth about what they have seen, and this truth did not find a way to the historiography. We have to deal with a major problem of use of testimonies, of the so-called bystanders. Paraphrasing, maybe this was a desert generation which so distorted the transfer of knowledge and experience that no objective research and no objective historiography could be done until the last of this generation would pass away. In certain way, it could, I could say that the post-war generation in Central Eastern Europe were deceived generations which received distorted knowledge of the Holocaust. But also in Israel and other countries, Jewish survivors did not manage to transfer their knowledge in this case due to other reasons. During the first years after the war, a part of Jewish survivors launched heroic vision of the struggle against the Nazis in the ghettos and partisans units, which excluded most of the survivors. On the other hand, many of them refused to speak about their tragic experience. It was not until the publication of article written by Andrzej Bykowski, Local Jewish Pogroms in June and July 1941, on the Polish borderlands, the article that was published in 1992, and later a book published by Jan Tomasz Gross, Neighbors, in 2000, that sparked a published debate about the role of the Poles and the local population in the murder of Jews during the war. This rediscovery of the truth about the reality of the occupation was primarily thanks to the use of Jewish relations, which contrasted with the existing historiography. It turned out that bystanders were not passive, but many of them took active role in murdering or persecuting the Jews. Shattering of national myths happened thanks to personal memoirs and testimonies of people who survived the Holocaust, and even those who did not survive but left behind them written testimonies. In my lecture, I would like to share with you some reflections concerning the value and use of testimonies and some questions related to it, as well as the contrast between official and for long time accepted historiography, which was suddenly shattered into pieces by revealing different currents of events and by careful study of testimonies. The testimonies also give us a personal narrative of the events, which is no less important than official documents of the civil and military authorities or investigation files and other documents. However, during the first years after the war, there was a tendency to write political, military or heroic history, frequently from the position of national ethos and national interest rather than searching the truth. On the other hand, the survivors in Poland, who were members of the Jewish Historical Commission, were collecting intensively hundreds and thousands of testimonies. However, those testimonies, mainly for political reasons, had not been able to find their place in the official historiography. A similar situation was also in Israel when in 1950s and 60s were collected thousands of testimonies. For similar reasons, those testimonies did not reflect in the historiography. Some way, hundreds of ISKCOR books were published at the same period. Most of them contain personal accounts, but the diffusion and use remain very limited. I think that the main problem in this contrast between the historiography and the testimonies was not the lack of the material, but the way the community of historians and the society in general was able to understand the Holocaust and accept different perspectives. It took many years until the personal account and personal experience became accepted and important and worth of writing and publishing. After the war, there were written important collection of testimonies which still are rarely used and which are which for many years were not accessible. I mean the testimonies which are a part of criminal proceedings. Those materials are very problematic, but however, they may shed some light on the events of the Holocaust. In Poland, after the war, there were thousands of trials following the August decree. In most cases, the defendants were accused of collaboration with the Germans, which include service in German local administration, denunciations of underground members, persecution of Jews, and others. In the case of Poland, this kind of shock therapy, as it was after the publication of Jan Tomasz Gross' book on the murder in Jedwabne, really worked. It provoked published debate in Poland and on the role of Poles during the Holocaust, and it provoked also new research on the events in the area of northeastern Poland, published, for example, by Institute of National Remembrance, as well as numerous books and articles on this subject published in Poland and abroad. However, we have to remember that Jan Tomasz Gross could write his book thanks mainly to a single account of one survivor, Chaya Finkelstein, written in Yiddish. This testimony was deposited long time ago and was accessible to the researchers. Thus, it was not a lack of material or inaccessibility of this material, but rather ability to the proper reception by the public opinion of the events in Jedwabne and several other villages around Łomża and Białystok, which were well known to the local population, but despite the collective memory of this population, as well as the knowledge by the member of Jewish Historical Commission, as well as Polish Main Commission for Investigation of Nazi Crimes, as well as Polish judicial system, it was hidden from the public because it did not serve the public interest, and it was in contradiction to national ethos. And in many cases, it would not have been permitted by the censorship. But the question I wanted to pose is how it was possible to write the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust for so many years, and what was the value of it. Those who knew about Jedwabne intentionally lied in their works. It was not a mistake, lack of understanding or omission. In the best case, it could be underestimation of the importance of those events. However, societies in many other countries did not go through this shock therapy, and there is still a battle between national, or rather nationalistic, historiographies and historical research, which is actually much more international in its nature, as less receptive to local historical policy. It seems to me that for many years, Holocaust testimonies of all witnesses and participants in the events were in contradiction to the historiography, but in recent years, those testimonies managed to find its own place and own way to be integrated into historiography and became an integral part of it. Being integrated, Holocaust testimonies changed also this historiography, and large spectrum of fields of research and subjects being discussed. The value of the testimonies was raised to a level of fully accepted documents. In many cases, single testimonies are the only surviving documents giving us a knowledge of the past. I can give a few examples. While writing about liquidation of the so-called village ghettos in Warthegau in September 1941, I had a lot of documents describing the whole process by bystanders. I have found only one testimony of survivors who had seen the deportation of Zagórów village ghetto from inside, and only by chance this family managed to escape and survive. But returning to the Polish eastern borderland, I was able to write about pogroms of summer 1941 in many places only thanks to testimonies of survivors. In many cases, the other side is missing because conspiracy of silence, lack of interest, sometimes illiteracy. In some other cases, testimonies of bystanders and perpetrators are deceptive, full of lacunae, misleading, and unbelievable. Perpetrators and bystanders have many layers of misleading information They sometimes have a powerful significance due to the banality and contrast between brutality and destruction on the one side and innocence and defenseless of the victims. Such was the case of a pogrom in Wąsosz in summer 41. I just want to quote a few fragments of court testimonies. I quote, "During this time we went together towards the market, and going ahead of us jumped a Jewess Zelmanówna. I don't know her name. Kozłowski noticed her and told me to kill her. I threw a stick, I hit her, and Zelmanówna fell. She could be about 20 years old. When she fell, came to her Kozłowski, and with a stick previously thrown by me, he struck her, hitting her 5 times in the head. Petkowski Julian, who was also with us, killed her. We all went together to the market. Leszczewski instructed Chrostowski to take the corpse of Zelmanówna, which Gołdowski and Petkowski threw him on the wagon." There's another fragment. "Around 10 o'clock in the morning, going to the church, I saw that Chrostowski, Bolesław, living in Wąsosz, drove a hay wagon with murdered Jews. Behind him walked Leszczewski Józef, who urged Chrostowski, saying to go quicker. Whether Leszczewski had something in his hand, I do not remember. On the street, one could see pools of blood. Most blood could be seen on the street reaching Szczucin. Leszczewski commanded Leszczewski commanded to come with a wagon in the morning, and I brought one wagon of sand to the street. There were some blood on the street, and I showered it with sand and went home. Then I heard that Jews were murdered, but who, I do not know." On the other hand, the Jewish testimonies give us a personal story, frequently dramatic and tragic. The research of the Holocaust has to take into account not only those accounts which give us a personal, humane perspective, which cannot be found in historiography, while dealing with the so macro and even sometimes micro history. This personal level is no less true and no less valuable, and certainly much more powerful and touching. And I want to give you just a few examples, very short. Examples of what happened after liquidation of the ghettos. On the roads, there were many lonely, crying children. These children have either fallen from the transport or left. Infants were crawling on the road and in the woods. Another fragment. And this Friday, when everybody learned that the authorities were wickedly deceiving and encouraging return to the ghetto, the Jews constantly returned to the city. They returned consciously to death along with the children and the older parents, not knowing what to do with themselves and where to go. The peasants would not let them into their huts. They did not give a piece of bread or a sip of water. It happened that when they met the Jews, they cut them with axes and knives, hunting Jews for robbery. At best, they transferred captured Jews to the hands of the authorities. Several times gathered several hundred Jews in Tuchin, who were killed in small groups in the Jewish cemetery. In another fragment, Jews in the ghetto wondered why I came back. When I asked them why they came back, they replied that they had come because they did not have courage to kill themselves, their children and loved ones, and they had no strength to suffer of hunger, cold, and cruel lies. In another fragment, which is also quite striking, near the forest were a few huts. Next to one of them stood a woman. I walked over to her and asked for a piece of bread. She answered that it was not her house and asked me to wait in the woods. In half an hour, she would bring me some bread. After some time, I look out of the woods near the hut. Except of a woman, there were now two men. One was holding an axe. He saw me and whistled to the other. I understood. We started to run and to a fig grove. I laid with my children on the ground. Children were silent because of fear and fell asleep. The forest was dark. The peasant with an axe repeatedly passed close to us, knowing that in this place we had to be hidden, but he didn't notice. As the witness stated, the Lord blinded his eyes. The man next to us had made marks on the young trunks of the grove and walked away. Such testimonies enable us to look closer on the question of survival, Jewish, non-Jewish relations, perspective of finding assistance, but also a feeling of helplessness and despair. Unfortunately, we have hardly any testimonies of bystanders describing with empathy the fate of Jewish children and Jewish mothers. I personally believe that all those elements are part of the history, like pieces of a mosaic, which gives us different pictures of and understanding dependent on the distance from the picture. From the distance, it can give nice and net, colorful, shining impression, like those national historiographies. But going closer, we can to see the cracks, fractures, unpolished and dull pieces, which, however, all compose one big image. History is not only Jewish but universal. It had to be true and unbiased by national belonging or sympathies, liberated from national myths and narratives. We have to try to complete this picture according to our knowledge and ability. However, many testimonies are still unused and inaccessible to researchers because of language limitation, dispersion of archival material, lack of appropriate platform for exchange of information. It seems that the intensive process of digitalization, new initiatives to build infrastructures permitting exchange of information concerning archival collections will expand our possibilities of finding new and still unexplored sources. Thank you.